Here we are back over in Max with the 4 boxes we created previously. And as I'm sure you know, if we want to edit the components of a primitive in Max, we need to convert it to an editable poly object by either using the quad menu and saying convert to editable poly, or if we want to keep our box primitive so we can edit it later, we can just add an edit poly modifier to the modifier stack. And once we do either of those, we have access to the vertices, polygons, edges, and so forth of our box here in the Modify tab. Well, let's see how MODO deals with the components of geometry. So I'll jump back over to MODO and make a cylinder in our empty mesh item layer. One other handy shortcut for making primitives is to select the primitive you want to create, hold down the Control key, and you can drag out a proportional primitive. And I can select the number of segments that I want, holding down my right mouse button. Okay, that looks pretty good. But now here's something to notice, and it's a big difference between MODO and Max when it comes to primitives. If I drop the cylinder tool by pressing the spacebar, in other words, if I deactivate the tool and make it not live anymore, I can't then come back, select the cylinder, and make changes to my initial cylinder settings, such as the number of segments. My cylinder primitive geometry is set. There are no options for it over here like there were when the tool was live. Think of it as always being automatically collapsed down to an editable poly object as soon as we drop the tool to create the primitive. Now, you might think you'll really miss the ability to go back and adjust your initial geometry like you can on the modifier stack in Max, but I've never really run into that with MODO. If I find that my initial geometry really needs more or less detail, MODO has a lot of tools to let me quickly go in and do that. So since all the primitives we've been creating work this way, once a primitive is created and the tool is dropped, you can start editing the components of the geometry right away. So let's look at how we do that. Up here we have our component modes, vertices, edges, and polygons. And I can switch between these by pressing the 1, 2, and 3 keys on the top of the keyboard. Also, if I just hit the space bar, I can quickly cycle through the component modes. And you'll notice that if I hold down the Control key, that the edges component becomes the boundary component, which is sort of like the border component in Max. Also, if I hold down the Shift key and hit the spacebar, I can toggle between my current component selection and item mode. So let's just select the vertices component. And you see if I move my mouse pointer over the vertices of my object that they start to highlight. And the same is true if I select Edges mode, see the edges highlighting, or Polygon mode. You see the polygons highlighting. And if I left click, I can select the polygon. And notice that it's not necessary to deselect a component to select another component. I can just keep clicking on different components here, and the previous one gets deselected automatically. And if I want to add to my polygon selection, I hold down the Shift key, and I can just keep selecting polygons, and they'll be added to the selection. And if I click in an empty area of the viewport, everything gets deselected. If I double click on the object in polygon mode, all the connected polygons will be selected. Now if I hit my Move tool, I can move all the polygons around inside my mesh item container. Now I'm going to drop the Move tool, click in the viewport to deselect all the polygons, and I'm still in polygon mode, and I don't have anything selected. But if I activate the Move tool again, you'll see that all the polygons still move around inside my mesh item container. And that's because in MODO, if nothing is selected, everything is selected. Let's try that again, but with edges. I'll select the Edges component mode, and even though I don't have any edges selected, if I bring up the Move tool, I can still move around inside the mesh item container. And that's because since none of the edges are selected, MODO treats all the edges as selected, just like it did with the polygons. There are some handy selection tools that you'll use a lot when you're working with components in MODO. If we double-click on an edge, we get the edge loop selected. And if we hold down Shift, we can select another loop, or another loop. And if I turn on the Move tool, I can move those edges around. Control Z to undo that. We can also go back to polygon mode, select a couple of polygons, and hit the L key to select a loop of polygons. The polygons you select initially gives MODO the clue which way you want the loop to go. We can also select a pattern of polygons. So I'll just select a polygon, hold down the Shift key, select another polygon, and then if I repeatedly hit the up arrow, MODO will keep selecting things in the pattern I established. Let's deselect those polygons. Also remember that we can use our lasso tool to select components, and we'll drag it out with our right mouse button. And we can change the tool by right-clicking and changing the lasso style. But you'll notice that when we're in a shaded view, components that are on the back side don't get selected when we lasso. If we want everything, even components on the back side selected, we'll use our middle mouse button to lasso. So I'm going to deselect everything, and now holding down my middle mouse button, I'll drag out my lasso, and now you can see that everything on the front and the back that was inside my lasso area gets selected. Let's drop that selection. I'm going to go over to polygon mode, drop that selection. Now if I select a polygon here and then another polygon over here, holding down the Shift key, if I hit Shift G, all of the polygons in between get selected. We can also easily grow a selection just by hitting the Shift up arrow, or shrink a selection by hitting the Shift down arrow. I'll deselect those and zoom in here a little bit. I can also just right-click on any component and MODO will select it and switch to the correct component mode automatically. So I'm just going to right-click over this edge, and my edge is selected, and I've switched to Edges mode. Now let's do the same thing with a polygon. I'm going to right-click on this polygon. The polygon comes selected, and MODO switches me to Polygons mode. And we also get some common modeling tools here in this popover menu. I mentioned the boundary component earlier, and we can activate that by holding down the Control key, and you'll see that Edges turns to Boundary. And let's say we want to select the edges around a certain group of polygons. Well, an easy way to do that is to just select the polygons. So I'll just make kind of an odd selection of polygons here. And then I can activate the boundary component. And when I click on it, all of the edges surrounding the polygons that I had selected now become selected. Another handy tool is the Convert tool. Now, since I already have these edges selected, I can just hold down the Alt key, and you'll notice up here that all of the components change to Convert. So for example, let's say I want to select all of the vertices that make up these edge selections. I can just hold down the Alt key and click on the Convert to Vertices. And now you'll see that all those edges I had selected are now selected as vertices. Another thing to note is that I can have 3 different selections. So I have these points selected. Now let's go over to Edges, and let's just select some different edges here. And then I'll go over to Polygons mode, select some different polygons here, and notice that if I switch between my components, that they all stay selected. Okay, let's go back into Vertices mode, fit that, and I'm going to deselect the vertices that I have selected. Now let's say that we need to move some points around in our model. I can select a vertex, activate the Move tool, and I can move my vertex around. And if I want to select another vertex, I have to drop the Move tool, select the next vertex, and then I can reactivate the Move tool and move it around. And if I want to select an edge, I can activate Edges mode, select the edge, activate the Move tool, and I can move that edge around. But there's a lot easier way to do all of this, and that's with the Element Move tool. So I'm going to drop the Move tool, hit the spacebar, deselect my edge. Now notice that if I hold down the Control key, that the Move tool changes to the Element Move tool. And if I activate it, and then hover my mouse over, say, a polygon, I can move that polygon. Or I can hover my mouse over an edge and automatically move that edge. Or I can hover it over a vertex and move that vertex around. All of this without having to drop my tool or change my selection mode. So element move is your best friend when you're editing the components of your geometry. Let's drop the element move tool and see a couple of other ways to activate it. So with no tool selected, I can hit the T key, and now I'm in element move, as you can see. And you can also access it from the Deform tab, and you can see it's already activated here. One other thing to know about the element move is that I can hold down my right mouse button and drag out a fall-off range. And now when I move, you'll see that I get everything within that fall-off range moving along with it. And if I right mouse again and drag, I can set my range back down to 0. And you can see our range down here is set to 0 now. And now I'm just moving single components around. So now let's talk about some of the component level specific tools MODO has. Let's get rid of this mangled cylinder, and remember that if I have nothing selected, everything is selected. So if I'm in any of the modes, vertices, edges, or polygons, and I don't have anything selected, so I'll deselect all my polygons. If I hit the delete key, since nothing was selected, everything was selected, so all the polygons get deleted. And now we have an empty mesh item layer. This time, let's make a capsule. Let's go back over to the Basic tab here under the Model tab. And if I click and hold on the cylinder primitive, you'll see I have some other primitives that I can choose from, one of which being the capsule primitive. So I'll select that. I'm going to hold down the Control key and drag that out. And then I can grab the top of it and make it a little taller. Hit A to fit it into our scene here. And then I'm going to use my right mouse button and increase the number of segments in my cylinder, or in my capsule. Hit the spacebar to drop that tool. And now I'm going to drag out a sphere in much the same way. So I'll just select the sphere, hold down the Control key, drag out my sphere. I'm going to leave the segments the way they are here. And then I'm also going to create a cube in its own layer. So I'll hit the N key for a new mesh item layer. Select the cube, hold down the Control key, and drag that guy out. Spacebar to drop the tool. All right, let's switch back over to our mesh item layer that contains our capsule and our sphere. Okay. One thing to be aware of with the sphere and the capsule is that they're created with subdivision surfaces by default. And you can see this if I hit the Tab key to toggle subdivision surfaces on and off. So now the subds are on, hit the Tab key, and now they're off. If I zoom in here on the sphere, you can definitely see the faceting going on when the subds are turned off. So again, this is subds off, subds on, subds off, subds on. That's just something to be aware of, that by default, MODO creates some primitives with subds turned on automatically. And for now, I'm going to turn these subds off on these primitives by hitting the Tab key. Okay, so now the capsule and the sphere do not have subdivision surfaces on. All right, back to the component level tools. So we're still in the Model tab, and you'll see down here on the side that we have a Vertex tab, an Edge tab, and a Polygon tab. These are the component level tools. For example, we can go into the Vertices mode, and then I can go down here, get my sphere in view a little better here. I'm going to go to the Vertex tab, and I'm going to go select some vertices. And then I'm going to hit the Bevel tool. And now when I drag in the viewport, you'll see that my vertices get beveled out. We can also turn on the Extrude tool and extrude out our vertices. Hit the spacebar to drop that tool. I can also turn on the Drag Weld tool, and this lets me quickly drag vertices and weld them together, like so. And I'll drop that tool, deselect vertices that I have selected. Let me select these vertices right here. And we have some other tools down here, like the Join tool, which will join the first 3 vertices that I selected to the last vertice that I selected. There you go. Now I'm going to select some vertices on my cylinder, or on my capsule. So I'll select that vertice, and shift select that vertice, shift G to select everything in between, and if I hit the align tool, it will snap all the selected vertices to a straight line between your first and last vertex that you selected. Now let's explore a few of the edge tools. Let's make sure that we're in Edges mode and in the Edge tab. I'll select some edges here, Shift G, and then we can extrude our edge. And I'll drop those edges and that tool. Let's select some more edges here. Okay, and now let's extend those edges. Select the Extend tool, and the Extend tool works along the axis of the work plane. So I'll just drag in the viewport here, and you can see it goes along the same axis that my work plane is oriented along. And you'll notice that these polygons are flipped, so we can fix that pretty easily. So I'm just going to hold down the Shift key and hit the up arrow, and you'll notice that all of the edges get selected. Now let's convert those edges to polygons. Hold down the Alt key, click on the Convert button. Now all the polygons are selected. I'll just hit the F key to flip the polygons. Let's deselect those polygons. And now let's say we want to add a loop inside of our capsule here. Go back to Edges mode, deselect those edges. And if I say Add Loop, I can just go in, click where I want the loop, drag it up and down, and it will put it where I want it. And if I drop the tool, I have a new loop, a new edge loop. Now I'm going to go in and add some points. And just so we can see what's going on here, I'm going to hit the O key to bring up our viewport options. Go to Active Meshes and say Show Vertices. And you can see now we can see all of the vertices in our mesh here. Now if I say Add Point, I can go in here, click on an edge. I can drag that wherever I want it. Spacebar to drop the tool, and we've added a point to our edge. Now I'm going to select an edge loop by double-clicking on it. And then if I hit the slide tool, I can just slide that edge loop up and down on my mesh and put it exactly where I want it. And I'll hit the spacebar to drop that tool and deselect that loop. And finally, let's look at just a few of the polygon tools. So I'm going to go into Polygon mode and select the Polygon tab, zoom in on the top of my capsule here. And just select a few polygons. And the first tool we're going to look at is the Shift tool. Select that. And if I drag out in my view, I can shift my polygons out. And it's similar to an extrude, but it uses each poly's normal to determine the direction. And now here's another great shortcut for you. After you perform an operation like using the Shift tool like we just did, don't drop the tool. And if you click your middle mouse button, MODO will repeat the last operation it did. So if I keep clicking my middle mouse button, MODO will keep growing the shift out. And this works with a lot of MODO's other modeling tools as well. Now let's see another shortcut that's sort of similar, and you'll use a lot. I'm going to go over here and select a polygon, drop the ones I already have selected, drop the Shift tool. So I've got a polygon selected. Now I'm going to hit the Bevel tool. I'm going to drag that out, and we have a nice bevel right there. And if I let go of my left mouse button, the tool stays active. But now if I click and drag in the viewport again, I'm just adjusting the bevel that I already have active. But what if I want to keep beveling out and changing the bevel as I go? Well, I can hold down the Shift key and click anywhere in the viewport and drag. And now I'm beveling out again from the polygon that I had selected. Let up. Now I'll hit the Shift, click and drag. Let up, shift, click, and drag, and so forth. And this is very handy when doing sub-D modeling. Speaking of the bevel tool, by default it's set to bevel the polys as a group. And you can see down here that group polygons is selected. Let's see what happens if we don't bevel polygons as a group. Let's deselect that polygon. Select these 4 polygons right here. I'm going to hit Shift B to select the bevel tool. And now let's bevel these 4 polygons out. And then let's turn off group polygons. And you can see the difference. Now we're beveling out each of those polygons individually. I'm going to turn group polygons back on. Okay, now I'm going to go select a loop of polygons here. Just drop the bevel tool, deselect those polygons, select a couple of polygons and hit L for loop. Okay. Let's get this where I want it to be. All right. Now let's bring up the bevel tool again. Shift B. And now with my bevel active, you'll see I can go down here to Profiles. And there are several pre-made profiles that I can choose from for my bevel. Let's just zoom in on them a little bit here. I'll select this one right here. And with that profile active, if I drag out in the viewport, you can see the change that it makes. Now we're using that custom profile as our bevel, as opposed to just the straight squared off bevel. And I can just go through a few of these other bevels here until I find the one that I want. And sometimes you may need to make some adjustments to these profiles. For example, this one looks like it's flipped around kind of weird. So you can go in here, you can reverse the inset, or you can reverse the direction and make that profile work the way you want it to. And if I want to get rid of the profile and just go back to the standard bevel, I can go back to the profiles and just control click on the bevel. And now you see I have the standard squared off bevel again. Another thing to be aware of is that some of the common tools like bevel have different options depending on the component mode you're in. To better demonstrate this, I'm going to go over to my cube that I created earlier. Just zoom in on him. And then I'm going to go into Edges mode, select an edge. And if I hit the B key, I'm in bevel mode, and I can bevel this guy out. But also notice that I have this round level option down here. And if I drag that out, you'll see that my bevel gets rounded off. And the same thing works if I select a vertex. So let's just select this vertex here, hit the B key for bevel. Can bevel him out. And also I have the round level option to round off that corner. But if I go over and select a polygon and hit the B key for bevel, you'll notice that I don't have that rounded option, but I do have the profile option. Like we saw earlier. And as you can see, we've really just scratched the surface of all of the mesh editing tools available in MODO, and going through all of them is beyond the scope of this series. We will come back to a few of these tools later on, but I would encourage you to explore all the other tools in the Deform, Duplicate, and Mesh Edit tabs on your own to see all of the options that are available to you when editing your geometry in MODO. Next, we're going to take a look at the tool pipe options in MODO. What's the tool pipe, you might ask? Watch the next video and find out.